I'd now like to introduce you to our featured guest, Kathi Kaiser. Kathi is the principal at Kaiser UX Associates, a UX consultancy specializing in usability testing, user research, and UX strategy. In 2001, Kathi co-founded Centralis, one of the first and most successful UX research firms. For more than 25 years, she's led top-notch teams in creating outstanding user experiences for Fortune 500 companies, startups, and cultural institutions. Kathi began her career at notable UX firms Hannah Hodge and Doblin Group. She's also served as adjunct faculty at Illinois Institute of Technology's Institute of Design, and she's currently pursuing her PhD in Business Experience Design at Bentley University. Kathi holds an MA in Social Science from the University of Chicago and a BA in Psychology from Georgetown University. When she's not in the office or on Zoom with us, Kathi can be found cheering on her favorite college volleyball team. You'll have to ask her which one because I don't sports ball. She loves traveling and she likes trying out new vegan recipes as well. So today she is here to share an almost forgotten research method using your competitors to do better UX research.
Thanks, everyone. It's good to be with you today. I'm excited to share with you how we can make use of our competitors to do more productive UX research. Thanks to Jess for the great introduction. I've been in the UX field for a while. I am not a mobster. I am a UX researcher, and I'm also a PhD student. So, I've got the industry lens in my day-to-day work, and for the last year, I've been digging into the academic side of things, which has been a really great opportunity. I'm a lot of other things as well as you can see along the bottom of the screen. Maybe these are touch points around which we can connect. So I'd love to meet with you, to chat with you if that's the case. But at any rate, why are we here today? So today I'd like to describe how you can learn more from your UX research by testing your competitors. And I want to be clear about this, that I'm not talking about competitive analysis. So not your, who do you always go up against in the marketplace? What features does your product have versus your key competitor in terms of, who people are thinking of buying from. All that's very important, and I hope you're doing that. I hope your marketing department is doing that. But this is actually kind of a different twist on competitive research. So I'm going to first talk about comparisons and why putting two things together in kind of a contrasting situation will produce more informative research. And then I'll talk about why your competitors are a great source for those comparisons. And we'll talk about what makes someone your competitor. In this context, it's a little bit different than that competitive analysis that I was talking about. And then I'll share 5 best practices for if you're going to do this type of research, things to keep in mind, kind of tips and tricks. Okay. All right, so let me make the case for why comparisons produce more informative research. So, we're human beings. We rely on both bottom-up and top-down processing to make sense of all of the crazy things out there in our environments. When I say bottom-up, I mean these automatic physiological processes in our sensory and perceptual systems that focus our attention and help us respond to things in an adaptive way. And by top down, I mean bringing in knowledge and experience and schemas and frameworks and everything that we've learned through our time on the planet that can help us interpret those things that are happening automatically. So, these two things come together to produce basically what we perceive as experience. And in that combination, our brains are specifically evolved to detect differences. And when you think about this, this makes sense in terms of keeping human beings alive, right? You need to be able to distinguish between, something in the forest that's food versus something that's poisonous. Or, in your peripheral vision, you need to see movement, a change, something different in your environment to alert you to a predator. So you turn your attention in that direction. So we're really good difference detectors. We're really good at seeing when things, are distinguished in some way. And these differences emerge in context. Like, we need all that contextual information for the differences to emerge. So as UX researchers, let's leverage this. Let's take advantage of these characteristics of our brains and how they're built to elicit more information from participants during research sessions. And a quick aside for a moment, I proceed under the assumption that, when we're doing research with our users, with prospective users, with people in the world, that time is precious. I hope all of you are always talking with people. You're always able to get your research agenda funded, that you're always in the field or in the lab. I know that's not often the case for everyone. And we really need to take advantage of the time that we do have. So that's kind of the spirit of this method as well. If we manage to get some research sold, we're with people, we want to make sure that we're extracting as much as possible from that. Okay. All right, so let me illustrate some of these comparison characteristics. So quick party trick here. I want you to look at the screen and think about what color you see. And while you're doing that, your perceptual system is in action. It is, there are some cones in your retina that are firing, the ones that are reactive to the wavelength of this color. There are others that are actively not firing, they're inhibited, and that's where that contrast comes from. That you've got cells that are focused on perceiving the edge of the box. So there's a lot of this bottom-up processing going on. Probably not a ton of top down because there's not a lot of context here, right? It's just a color block. And by the way, I know these color experiments are a little hard in the digital world because your monitor is probably set differently from mine, but just go with it. Hopefully we'll still be able to make the point. All right, so how about now? What color do you see? All those bottom-up functions are still going on, but there's perhaps a little top-down processing added to the mix. You may recognize this as a word or not, depending on your prior experience and your knowledge. You may know what that word means or not, and that word may conjure up memories, context from your background that could impact what color you see. Okay, so let's do this one. Okay, so same thing, we've got the bottom up and the top down kind of coming into the mix to give you information about what you're looking at. And now I'll just take those away and ask you to think, how many different colors do you feel like you saw? Did you see? How many different colors have we seen? Okay. And so when you think about this from a, wavelength perspective, from a hex code perspective, each of these blocks was the same. It had the same characteristics. However, what you saw may have been very different based on the information that you were provided. So it's possible, and again, I don't know because I don't know what you're seeing on your screens, but it's possible that the one on the left looked maybe a little bit more purple, and the one on the right maybe looks a little bit more brown, right? And who knows what you thought when you first saw it without that context. It could have been one of those, or it could have been something else altogether, right? So the point here is that we're using this information from our brains, bottom up, from the environment and our memories, top down, to construct what color this is. I can't really tell you what's the right answer here. There is no right answer. It's what you perceive. So diving into the academic research for a second, Kubat and colleagues took a look at this effect in a study called Semantic Context Effects on Color Categorization. And the stimuli were a little bit different. And again, same problems with monitor colors here. But the idea is that participants were asked to label an ambiguous color, a color that could be one thing, could be another, in the context of either words or icons that were not neutral, right? So on the left, you've got yellow and pink, and you've got a bird that looks an awful lot like a flamingo, just traditionally pink. And sure enough, what they found is people were more likely to say that's pink as opposed to that's yellow. And you can imagine if it was a canary instead of a flamingo, they'd probably say, oh, that's yellow instead of that's pink. So that's the icon condition. This also works with words. So school bus, ambiguous color. Oh, school buses are often yellow. They're more likely to say it's yellow. If the word was, I don't know, feather boa or Barbie, maybe people would be more likely to choose pink. So, the idea here is that people are using contextual cues to determine meaning, like what something actually is. Okay. So you may recall back in 2015, this dress that broke the internet because people couldn't agree on what color it was. If you're not familiar, I'll very quickly hit the highlights here. Someone on Instagram posted this picture of a dress and made a comment about what color it was. And other people commented, what? It's not that color, it's this other color. And it just went to town from there. People were very heated in their opinions about what color this dress was. There were some variations, but people either thought it was black and blue or white and gold for the most part. And again, this is just the same picture twice. I have no idea what colors you're seeing, and I won't share what I'm seeing. But people were really dug in on this. And I'm sure you've seen other optical illusions that are easy to reverse. So the figure ground problems where, like, is it a vase or is it two faces looking at each other? Those types of things, if you look at it long enough, you can kind of shift your perspective usually. But the dress didn't really allow you to do that. Only a very small percentage of people can shift from, seeing one set of colors to the other. So what's going on here? This kind of baffled vision researchers. And so some folks at Yale did a study. They did a survey of over 13,000 people who had seen the dress. And they asked questions about the image. So what colors do you see? What time of day do you think it is? Is it taken inside or outside? How is it lit? And are your perceptions persistent or have they changed? And then also questions about the perceiver. How old are you? What's your gender? Do you live in the city or in the country? Are you a morning person or a night owl? A bunch of questions. And they did a big regression analysis. And what they found is that the colors that people saw were most often predicted by the type of lighting they assumed in the photo. So if you look at this image and and this isn't a conscious thing, this is that bottom up processing. You are assuming that it's natural light, so it's like outside, but it's in shadow, then you probably saw white or gold. By the way, the dress actually, like, someone owns this dress, it does exist in the world, and it is blue and black, which I have to say blows my mind because I see white and gold and I still I can't see it as blue and black, but that is in fact what it is. All right, so what's going on here? The authors published this nice article on Slate, which I'd recommend if you want to learn more about this. But they have this GIF to illustrate the impact of light on the colors that are perceived. So you see in the lighter light scenario, you get one set of colors, and in the softer light, you get another. And the funny thing is that this, kind of back and forth that's happening, your brain is doing that. It's not that there's some, right now the computer's doing it, but as you're perceiving it, you are making assumptions based on your past experience and, your sleep patterns, it turns out, about the lighting conditions. And that's what's generating your perception. So that's what color the dress is to you. All right, so I just think this is a fascinating example. But I did want to very quickly throw in something that doesn't have to do with vision. A lot of our perceptions, of course, are visually based, those of us who are seeing, but this does apply to other kinds of senses as well. So for example, we have here a sandwich. Is this chicken salad or tuna salad? It's ambiguous. So fun fact about me, I have no sense of smell. I haven't since birth. I do have a sense of taste. I have no idea if it's the same as the sense of taste for people who can smell. I just don't know. But at any rate, this is a bit of a conundrum for me because I look at this sandwich and I can't smell it. Usually you can tell tuna from chicken, as I understand. Tuna is a pretty strong smell, but I would be at a loss. And the thing is, even if I took a bite of it, I still wouldn't know because my brain wouldn't have enough information to distinguish something that has a similar texture. So I have this concept of a chicken salad sandwich and a tuna salad sandwich, and there just wouldn't be enough information for me to determine which one I was dealing with. There is a way around this, though, which is to take a bite of one and then a bite of the other. And as soon as I do that, it's like, oh yeah, I got it. This is chicken, this is tuna. And it's really striking. I've done this, and it's like, how could I have ever not known, right? Because as soon as my brain has that additional context, it can fill in the blanks and help me distinguish what's what. All right, so a couple more of these real quick. Apologies for this bad photo. This is probably the first photo ever taken on a cell phone. This is my nephew. And he was a little guy when he was born. And I wanted to get a sense of, well, how little was he really? So we put Grover next to him. And now you can see the size of, the baby versus Grover. Although I still wasn't sure years later that this fully captured how little this guy was. So another bad photo, sorry, but I stuck my hand in there. So you can see he's little. His whole, core of his body is the length of my hand, which is sort of an average size hand. So, you may not have realized that just looking at him in his bouncy chair, but once you put these contextual elements next to him, it becomes more clear. This kind of became a gag in our family. And so every year on his birthday, we took a picture with Grover. And as you can see, he has grown up to be quite a large gentleman. Grover has remained the same. All right, so last one, we have a photo here of some homes. And in your mind, just think about, what you observe about them. What are some characteristics that you notice in looking at this photo? Some things may pop up for you. And now we have a second photo of different kinds of homes. Now, it's possible that you have, immediate visual processing capability and you were able to see everything about all of these all at once. But it's more likely that once you saw the second image, you may have noticed things about the first image that hadn't really stuck out before. Things like the roof line, maybe. Perhaps you didn't notice the peaked roofs in the first one and the more slanted forward roof in the second one. Or, the way parking is handled. You might not have thought parking was relevant at all in the first photo, but then you look at the second photo, you're like, oh, the parking is oddly in the house. Maybe that's something we should think about. So putting these things in juxtaposition helps you notice more detail about them. All right, so to summarize what we've learned about comparisons, they enable more informative research by helping you define meaning in context, because we are engines that detect differences and we rely on context for those differences. They help us distinguish key characteristics. We really can't tell what something is until we know what it's not. Comparisons help us establish degrees of difference, so whether two things are pretty similar or pretty different. And then it helps us highlight additional details to have our participants comment on or for us to explore in our questioning. All right. So on to point 2, what about competitors? What makes competitors the best comparisons? So let's take a moment and explore what I mean by competitors. Direct competitors are products that solve your same design problem, but probably in a different way, maybe in a very different way. So, if the design problem is how do you open a wine bottle, see lots of ways here. These are, very different. There are very different mechanisms, different physics involved in these. So it's a nice competitor set. What works best? What do people like about one versus the other? How can we use these contrasts to get that additional information? It works in digital space as well. Lots of sites have some sort of login interaction, lots of patterns out there for handling that in different ways. So direct competitors can help you just kind of look at these alternatives. And they're available. Now, they're not always freely available, but a lot of things are accessible just out there on the internet or in the world. If they're not free, then maybe they're easy to get. Maybe someone in your organization has an account, or there are ways. We've actually recruited people to help us get access to competitor interfaces. But the key thing is that they exist, meaning that you don't have to prototype them. If you're trying to decide, should you design, your product following this approach or that approach, you could build one of them. It takes twice as long to build two about. But if someone else has already done that, they've already invested all that time, hey, use it, right? It's out there. So they're kind of a nice library of things to choose from. Okay. For companies that are new to UX research, which I hope there aren't many of those left, but I'm sure there are, it may be easier to sell in the concept of UX research by studying your competitors as opposed to your own product. So if people in your organization are skittish about watching someone use the product and, oh, it's that's too dangerous for me politically, then you can say, well, we're just going to test these 3 competitors so you can get a sense of what this research is like and what you can learn from it. And then, hopefully that makes them more comfortable for bringing your product into the mix as well. And then finally, in thinking about who your competitors are, they exist at multiple levels, depending on the nature of your research question. So I'm going to dig into that in more detail now. I'm going to give you kind of a framework or a matrix to think about, okay, well, who are my competitors for this given research question at hand? All right. So one dimension is the distance from your product or your business. And then another dimension is the level of analysis that you're looking to do in this particular initiative. So we'll take the horizontal dimension first. I've mentioned direct competitors. These are products that, or companies that offer the same product in the same industry. You share a user base, same tasks would be supported by these products. Probably not 100% overlap, but pretty good. These are your go-to. These are the people you often think of when you think about competitors. That said, there are also domain competitors. So imagine zooming out just a little bit. And these are folks that offer similar products in maybe a similar industry with about the same user base doing about the same thing, but the context is just a little bit different. So an example might be if you're a health insurance company, maybe this is a car insurance provider or a travel insurance provider. So things that are, roughly the same, but just a little bit different. That can give you some nice new ideas to explore. And then zooming out even further, you can think about analogous competitors. So these are folks that are in different businesses. They have different products, different industries. It's handy if the user base is roughly the same, because if you're looking to do research, you want to have products that are familiar to your participants that you've recruited. And the task can be analogous. So, a login, for example, would be a good instance here where you log into your health insurance portal. You also log into your Spotify account, for example. So different businesses, whole other different set of considerations, but some things are analogous. And so that might be informative for you. Okay. And then going up the other dimension in terms of level of analysis, you probably think about these things all the time. How specific is my question for this, research initiative at hand? Is it kind of at the pixel level? So this is, detailed usability, it's interaction design, page layout, content layout, kind of the nitty gritty of how the product works. You kind of open the aperture up a little bit on that. You start looking at questions that are more about paths. So the information architecture of your product, process flows, your navigation systems, things that happen between the pages or through, across the experience. And then an even broader lens is, well, what is the product? What is the portfolio of products we offer? This is where service design considerations come in. So, depending on the nature of your question of the moment, you might want to think about who is competing with you at these different levels. Okay. So when we put these two dimensions together, we get a nice framework for kind of brainstorming about, all right, well, who should we look at? What comparisons would be fruitful for generating these contrasts and getting this additional information from this research based on, the distance from the product we want to look and our level of analysis. So I'm going to share some quick case studies of these three different projects that we've worked on throughout the years to give you a flavor of kind of how this might work. All right, so at the most detailed level for both dimensions, we have direct competitors at the pixel level. And for this, it was a little while ago, and we were testing brochures, which, of course, they have all this information online as well. But I don't know, if you travel at all and are on anybody's mailing list, I still get these, physical mailings all the time. We call it travel porn. It's kind of fun to flip through them and think about, imagine these trips. But in this case, the product was a cruise tour in Alaska, which I've personally never taken. Sounds fabulous. You cruise for part of it. You are on land for part of it, either on a train or via bus. They're complex itineraries. Sometimes they go north to south, sometimes south to north, different lodging options. So it's a lot to think about when you're planning. And this product, this cruise tour idea, is offered by many different cruise lines. So our client wanted to understand, well, what is the best way to present this information in these brochures? And here are some examples of how different brochures do it. Now, we chose these because they're different in interesting ways that we had questions about. Okay, so the two on the left organize the itinerary in terms of chronology. So day one, you're here. Day two, you're here, from the start of the trip to the end. Is that the way people want to learn about a trip? Maybe. Or maybe on the right, it's organized by features. So here are our different options. And this one is 10 nights. And here, the land tour is before or after the cruise. And it's more of a side-by-side comparison of the characteristics, independent of when those things happen. So which is best? But we wanted to take this to folks and get feedback on that and see what resonated, what made sense. Another difference that varied in a different way across these three options was whether words were used primarily for communication or icons. So this one on the bottom is very light on words. It has some destinations, but it's using these little icons to indicate you're on a plane, you're on a bus, etc. Whereas the other two are more explicit with language. They use words. So which is better? I don't know. Let's find out. All right, so I have a very short video clip as this participant uses these, and then I'll kind of summarize the highlights after.
Okay, this is embarrassing, but I have a feeling this is like an important page because it's going to tell me, the cities and that, but it's hard for me to follow. I would actually rather see this in printed form than, in pictures, and I'm trying to decipher the pictures and that.
So it sounds like the pictures make it difficult to understand.
Yeah, and just the format of it, I would rather just see it in regular printed form, bullet, this city, this tour, bullet, this city, this tour, day 2, day 3. That would be easier for me to follow. Oh, okay, so this really helps. This says, this gives you in the beginning the nights, and then it says how many days of the cruise, and then 1 night in the Wilderness Lodge, and Denali, one night at Mount McKinley, 1 night in Anchorage. This is easier for me to read.
Then,
yeah,
so you find this one easier to read?
Absolutely. This I got totally lost on, and this exactly, it shows me the cruise, how many nights and where. Also says the price and the dates and the name of the ships. So it's got all the information I need to start with.
All right, so we saw some nice output based on her ability to look at these two together. So a few things to point out there. She used one of the brochures first to complete a task, and this is just a clip, but that was the setup. And then did some other tasks, kind of finished with that brochure. And then we said, all right, let's do the same thing with the second brochure. So she was doing the same tasks with the second stimulus. And, of course, she's not going to forget what just happened with the first one. So it's like, oh, right. That first one, I mentioned that those images or those pictures were hard, but this one spells it all out for me. This is great. Which, we can't, of course, run the same session with the same person with it reversed, but it's possible that she might not have commented so much on how explicit the second one was if she hadn't struggled with the first one being more ambiguous. So just a quick example of how valuable it is to have people, and then after she did the second one, she literally brought them side by side, which is always nice. Have them, use one, use another, and then do the direct comparison. You can learn a lot from what they think is, similar or different about the two experiences. Okay. All right, so zooming up, a quick example on the path level. And here we're talking about domain competitors. So our client for this initiative was Brightline Trains. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. They're kind of just getting going. They're a train line in Florida for now and hoping to expand to California as well. And private train company linking up Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach, and I think now they go all the way to Orlando. So kind of trying to deal with the congestion in South Florida and provide a train experience. So who are their competitors? Well, in the US, Amtrak is really the only other game in town when it comes to trains, and they have routes in that same area. So they're the direct competitor, and it made sense to include them in our study. But also, there are some interesting characteristics of Brightline that kind of align them in a domain way with Uber and American Airlines. So I'm not sure if they're still doing this, but when they started, Brightline would actually, you could arrange a pickup from your location if you were within 5 miles of the train station. So it's kind of like ordering an Uber, right? So it's like an Uber leg, and then you get on the train and you take the train. And then when you get where you're going, if your destination is within 5 miles, you can book a car to take you there as well. So Uber, while not a train, is transportation. So it felt appropriate to look at the same kind of task with that platform. And then I know some Amtraks do allow you to reserve seats, but for the most part, that's not the case. But you can on Brightline. All seats are reserved on Brightline. So that was kind of like an airplane, right? Well, not Southwest, although it's coming. So we looked at American Airlines and their seat selection process and how does that compare with Brightline. So kind of using bits and pieces of these different competitors to get feedback on the experience that Brightline was considering. So here, this was a quantitative study, so I know these images are a little peppered with hotspots and stats. But the questions were generally about information architecture. It's kind of visual target finding, if you will. So, we were able to use Brightline versus American to look at, even beyond seat selection, things like, saving your payment methods, different, modes of transportation, but same domain and same task. And then we were able to look at Brightline versus Uber for like preloading costs and buying a pass and things like that. So these, even though they weren't direct, if we had just stuck with direct competitors, would only have Amtrak to work with. And that would give us some information. But if we've expanded that lens a little bit to include other transportation options, then we have more things to compare. All right. And then our final example are analogous competitors at the product level, so the upper right corner of that matrix. And the client here is the American Medical Association. And they have, among other things, they do a lot of things, they have an educational platform for medical professionals to stay up to date on their learning, to earn certified medical education credits. It's basically this clearinghouse of information to stay up to date on medical content. And while this is run by AMA, they get their content from a variety of sources. So they produce some, but they're not producing all of it, they're aggregating. So in trying to understand, well, how is this product performing? Are we meeting physicians' needs? What else should we be doing? These were kind of big level strategy questions. They, of course, wanted to look at other providers of medical education, the direct competitors. They're important. So we included a couple of those in our sample here to get a sense of the direct comparison. But then, they said, well, we're about learning broadly and, not necessarily medical. I mean, our content is medical, but there are a lot of other learning platforms out there. Maybe we can get some good insight from those. So we included some domain competitors that are more sort of general business or broader scale in terms of the topics they cover, LinkedIn Learning and Skillsoft. But then even beyond that, they wanted to go broader. They're like, well, we're a learning platform, but what we're really doing is we're aggregating information. We're bringing all different types of content together. Are we doing it well? We don't know. What else, who does that well that we can learn from? And so for that, we looked at these, things that you might think are way out there from a competitive standpoint for the AMA, Apple News, Google News, even Spotify and Stitcher, which is a podcast app, which I believe is no longer. But these are different platforms for aggregating information. So, each level of these competitors is a little further away in terms of direct comparison, but analogous in terms of the problem they're trying to solve. So this was actually a pretty lengthy evaluation. I can't share too much of the details, but just wanted to give you a snippet in terms of what is useful here. In our analysis, we did make a distinction between the learning platforms and the media platforms, just because there were so many competitors here that, it's hard to kind of keep your head around who did what and what problems are shared versus distinct. So that, while they were all in our set, that distinction was relevant in our analysis. And then the nice thing about it is in reporting this out, we're focused on our product in sharing what we learned. What does all this mean for our product? But then we can point to these competitors as models. So yeah, you should do this. And you know what? Do it like Google News. They do this, whatever it is, this recommendation, they do it really well. Or, hey, you're doing this great, keep doing what you're doing, and maybe you can learn some things from PubMed, for example. So this is a nice way to have these competitors enhance your recommendations because they give you examples out there in the marketplace that you can riff off of. All right, so just to quickly summarize what we've talked about so far, comparisons extend the value of our UX research by helping you learn more about your product. Again, we're not really doing this to learn about the competitors. We want to know, what are the competitors doing that we can leverage, right? Or how does that contrast tell us more? If we're that first set of townhouses, how does showing a second product tell us more about them? Because people clue into details that they might not have seen before. And competitors are a great source for these comparisons because they are out there and they are ready-made for the most part, and you don't have to invest in developing two approaches when you can borrow one from the world for your research. And then when choosing your competitors, keep that matrix in mind. You want to match the level of analysis with your research question, something detailed, something more structural or portfolio level, and then looking at those direct domain and analogous competitors to kind of give you some fodder to brainstorm about, okay, who should we be looking at to learn from for our particular problem? All right, so I just want to wrap up with 5 best practices for getting the most from this type of research. If I've sold you on it, if you're like, yes, I want to bring competitors in, I want to go do this research right now, this is what we've learned, tips and tricks make it go well. First off, if you can, you want to keep your participants blind to who the study sponsor is. Now, if you're working in-house, sometimes this isn't possible. But if you have the opportunity to, recruit someone for research and just say, hey, we're going to be looking at cruise brochures. I'm not going to tell you what cruise line I'm representing. I may not even be any of them. And, we've done research like that where we've only looked at competitors and not because our company's product didn't exist yet, for example. So if they don't know, then they're more likely to just, provide general feedback about whichever ones you show them. And they're not thinking that you're, leaning towards one. It could go either way. They could be harsher on your product or they could be nicer to your product because of their assumed relationship between you and it. So blind is good. Have people interact with it before they compare. So as we saw in the video clip, we didn't just put these 2 brochures in front of the participant and say, hey, which one do you like better? We want them to have that task-based experience because, of course, as we all know, because we're all researchers, that influences what people see and how they interpret. That task lens kind of focuses their attention. So we want to preserve that in the research. We want to, do that with one, and then switch to the second interface, do the same protocol with the second one. And then, if they don't automatically compare, which they often do, then you can bring the first one back and say, okay, let's talk about what's different across these. And what do you think about that? In terms of people's capacity, we generally recommend, having people perform the tasks with no more than 2. Sometimes you can throw a third one in at the end, like, oh, hey, here's the third approach. What do you think about this? But if you have them perform the tasks with more than 2, then they start to get confused about, they comment about something. You're like, that wasn't in the third one. That was in the second one. And then it's harder to parse their comments and know what they're really referring to. So it does have sample size implications. You want to make sure you have enough sample that each interface has the opportunity to be one of those 2 that you're showing, which speaks to the next point, which is counterbalancing and randomizing the order of products and tasks. So spreadsheets are your friend with this kind of research, where you want to make sure that each interface is going first an equal number of times, that it's being paired with, with other competitors an equal number of times. You don't know if you're testing 3, you don't always want 1 versus 2 and 2 versus 3. You want to make sure you have some 1 versus 3 in there. And you want to make sure that sometimes 1 goes first, sometimes 3 goes first. So it's important to kind of keep these things mixed up because order effects and learning and, can influence what people bring from one experience to the other. So balancing that out helps with that, or at least helps you identify the impact of those effects because they will happen. All right. And then if you have observers for your research, it's helpful to just give them a heads up about what they're going to see in any given session. So we've had situations where we've got, our client company and then two competitors, and the key stakeholder shows up in a session that is just looking at the competitors. And they're like, well, where's my product? Show them my product. Like, oh boy. So, you want to make sure you're clear about what is going to be tested in each session, or be flexible about, like, make sure your schedule can accommodate a last minute. Actually, we're going to look at this one too, because so-and-so's here and they really want to see that one. So better to, have your plan and make sure people know it, but be able to riff if necessary as well. And then finally, focus your reporting or your results, or however you share out what you learned from the research, on your product. Don't be concerned with reporting out everything you learned about every product, because that's just going to, double, quadruple your effort and your time, and it'll be a lot of weeds for people to get through as well. So you remember that your product is what you're trying to learn about, and the competitors are just your different viewpoints, your different contrasting elements. So tell the story of your product and illustrate with differences from the competitors. That helps keep your workload manageable and helps keep the story clearer for the audience. All right, and that is what I had to share with you today. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
We have quite a few that have come through. Oh, that's awesome. Okay, let's see. Kathi, if you will stop sharing, I think we will get your face. There we go. We got faces. Awesome. All right, our first question is from Doug Baker. He says, what's a reasonable scope for comparisons to maximize insights? Is there a point where one goes overboard with selecting too many competitors? And you sort of touched on this. How do you know when you've gotten to too many?
Yeah, so absolutely, you get to a point of diminishing returns, but it's kind of a complex equation in terms of how deep your research questions are, how broad the inquiry is, and how much time and resources you have, honestly. So 2 to 3, 2 works well. It's kind of nice to throw a third one in there as a comparison point. For most like qualitative usability testing kinds of studies or interviews where you're showing people things, like that's a good amount. Some of these studies where we had more competitors, larger samples, were also evaluation. So not all of those interfaces went to the user. Some of them did. Others were us, providing our expert analysis on differences. So I would say, design for 2 to 3, and if you've got a lot of budget and you can have 40 sessions and you want to throw more in, great. But more often than not, that's not the case. But if you have a few others in your back pocket, should questions come up that you want to be able to address with somebody who does something a particular way, then you can pull that out, or you can raise it with your sponsors to see if you can get an expansion of the scope.
Awesome. Ashley asked a similar question that kind of follows on. What would be the time expectation for participants to complete the whole comparative study? And is this best moderated or unmoderated?
So we've done both moderated and unmoderated. I should just put my bias on the table. I'm a qualitative researcher. I always want to talk to people. I always want to ask the follow-up questions. So that is definitely my preference. But that said, if you're careful in your study design, you can do this on an unmoderated platform. You still have to do all that counterbalancing and split your sample. I think in the Brightline study, we had different links for one that did Brightline in American, and one that did Brightline in Uber, and one that did Uber in American. And, so you have to carefully control that, but it is, in either type of approach, you can do this. In terms of participant time for qualitative, we always try to design for an hour or maybe 90 minutes. Like some B2B software, you need a little bit more time. But if you can think about, okay, what can someone get done in an hour? Then that can kind of shape your tasks and help prioritize your research questions. And then if you've got more content than an hour will allow, then you add, more participants. So, maybe not everybody does all tasks, but, if you've got an hour's worth of content for each of them and you swap tasks in and out, then you can cover the full scope of your research question. But beyond an hour, and it's kind of like the no more than 2, maybe 3. If you go too much longer, people get confused and it becomes less useful.
Yeah, glaze over. Sure.
Mhm.
That makes sense. Okay, Nina had a question that sort of followed on Doug's question about scope and selecting how many competitors. And then I asked a question about ethics. So I'm going to kind of see if I can mash these together. So my question was, I have a paid subscription to an app that is sort of like the app that we're testing, but it's not public, right? I've paid for private access to this. What are the ethics around testing with something that I have exclusive access to, a competitor that I have exclusive access to? And then Nina's point is, even something that might be sensitive, like the inner workings of an account that they need specific credentials to get to, like a bank account or a private company intranet, something along those lines. How do we balance the desire to gain insights with the need to respect competitors' terms and of service and privacy?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have like the answer about where that line is, but I can tell you how we've addressed this in a couple of instances over time. So it kind of as a slight variation just on your scenario, we wouldn't use our own products. Like if I happen to have a subscription to something, I wouldn't use that in research. But if I know I want people who are customers of a particular bank, for example, I would recruit for that. And I'd be very upfront in the recruiting process that we are going to ask you to log into your account and show us how you do XYZ.
Mhm.
And your very generous incentive is the balancing for the give up of the personal information. And there are other protections as well. We often don't record that portion of the sessions, or we blur things out, or we record it for us, but then we don't share it with our client. So there are different ways of handling the privacy concerns. But we basically put that question on the person who owns the product, right? The subscription. I could hear arguments that is still on the other side of that ethical line. And, it's something that is definitely worth continuing to discuss. But, from our perspective, if someone understands what we're asking them to do and they are comfortable with that, then that's their choice. And we've just been very upfront about what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Great. I think that's a great answer. Yana asks, and several folks mentioned this in the chat, that internally they have some resistance to testing on their own product, or they're maybe resistant to research on their own product in general. And so she says, what would you recommend if the business doesn't see the value of investing time in this? Like, how do you approach selling the idea that it's worth the time and investment to do this, even when it's hard to find users to talk to or examples to benchmark against?
So one thing that I found helpful is to do a cognitive walkthrough. Even if it's not, I mean, sometimes I'll just do it myself. I work as a consultant, so I'm not an insider. So that, has a little bit more, it gets attention, right? Some outsider is looking at the product. If you're in-house and everybody knows you and you know the product well, I mean, it sounds a little funny, but maybe there's someone in your life who would be willing to act as a participant for you and not run a formal test, but pull up the product, assuming it's a digital product for a moment, pull it up on Zoom, hit record, and have them think aloud while they're trying to do a task. And maybe it's not too hard, maybe it's very challenging, but just share that thought process. I use this technique sometimes in business development meetings because I'm like, well, I don't know what you know about what people think of your product, but here's one example, and just one example, and caveat it like crazy. But people's eyes open because they're like, oh, I never thought about it that way. Or and you got to be careful, because if the person is very negative, like I wouldn't have someone trashing the product in a sales context. It's more like seeing it through their eyes. So just even 5 minutes, one task, a short video, and say, look, this is the idea of what research is like. We can do a lot more if we put together a study, and we can make sure we're recruiting the right people, and we can identify the tasks we want them to do. And here's how we'll share the results. So basically, it's like, it's the amuse-bouche, if you will. Give them a little taste of what it might be like, and then take it from there.
Awesome. We have one last question for you from Helen. Do you have any best practices on the areas of comparison for the different levels of comparison? So product level, path level, task level. Are there specific best practices on each of those?
I would say it's not really specific to any one, but it applies across all of them, which is just make sure you're picking competitors that do things very differently. So, at the pixel level, that might be, a different interaction model, like just because it's off the top of my head, the login, maybe one is a username password and another is username or email and get a code or, things that are different because that gives your participants something to talk about. And then I would say, thinking about those two dimensions, the product level is probably where it's most interesting to look at further out competitors. So, usually you're doing product level research because you want to understand, well, what else can we do? How can we innovate? Like your question is bigger. So that might be a good opportunity to expand your competitor set as well. Like one example that I tried to work in and didn't manage to is that there's a museum here. I'm in St. Louis, which is a wonderful city. It's a smaller city and we have a great art museum, but we don't have 5 art museums. We pretty much have one. There are a couple small ones, but there's one. So it could consider the other art, the smaller galleries as its competitors, or what it actually does is it considers the St. Louis Cardinals as a competitor and the Jazz Club as a competitor. And, it basically, because they're looking at how else do we attract people on a Friday night to come to an event, they're defining the competitive set more broadly. So those questions might be like, the more you go further away from your product in both directions, you might learn more from those differences.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathi. That's amazing.